I think it's on the, oh, yeah.
Welcome to this public sector deep dive session on professionalism for performance, innovative public management. My name's Clare. I'm an associate professor of economics here at the Blavatnik School, and my panelists are on my left. I'm not going to do long introductions because you've all got those bios in your conference packs, but let me just say the names. There's Dr. Martin Williams, Nana, Kwasi, Agyekum, Dwamena, Theresa, Reno-Weber, and Kate Josephs. And the panelists are all going to speak in turn for 5 to 7 minutes, very precise, I've been told. And then we'll have a chance to respond to each other, and then we'll have moderated discussion with the floor. Okay, so over to you, Martin.
Great, thank you, Claire. So as we were trying to frame this panel and thinking about what I was going to say for it, the brief was on, how do we actually get a public sector that delivers, and to bridge this gap, as we've been talking about this morning, between what citizens' expectations and what government is able to deliver are. And at conferences like these, there are a lot of sessions like this, and most of them revolve around for the past 3 decades, not only have these kind of sessions, but also most civil service reform efforts have revolved around, in some sense, how do we make government more like the private sector? And so there's been a lot of emphasis in rhetoric and in reforms on introducing incentives into the public sector, both in the sense of sort of performance-related pay, but even sort of softer incentives, like just having performance be in some sense relevant for promotion or for firing, that kind of thing. There's also, I think, in the past 15 to 20 years, that's been joined by a focus on data and transparency and monitoring, that the way that we're going to get performance in the public sector is by having more data, by monitoring what workers are doing more strictly, by having KPIs, by reviewing them, and that kind of thing. And kind of together, I think of these two approaches as being comprising what we think of as performance management, and it's kind of the default way that we often talk about performance in the public sector. But there's also another approach to managing government organizations and bureaucracies, which is to think about professionalism, right? Not only are a lot of people who go into the public sector very public-spirited and motivated to go into the public sector because they want to make the world a better place, but even people who don't particularly go in for those reasons are professionals and want to see themselves as professionals. And what professionals like to do is be able to do their jobs well and use discretion and use it appropriately and go home at the end of the day and think, yeah, I did a good job today. I used my expertise as it should be. That's also got a long tradition in the public sector, but I think in the past few decades, there's been sort of a shift away from it, or a kind of a mistrust of this idea that civil servants should have autonomy, and we should rely on their professionalism. We should actually allow them to have discretion rather than trying to remove it. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and well-founded reasons, right? There are a lot of contexts where there's very little accountability, where corruption is a big issue, where lack of motivation is a big issue. And so people, I think, rightly distrust or worry about what will happen if we give public servants autonomy. Are they just going to abuse it? So as an academic, I thought, this is a case where there are plausible arguments on both sides. Let's actually go out and do some research and get some data and see what we find. And that's one of the things that we've been able to, or that myself and my co-authors have been able to do as part of a research collaboration these last 5 years with the government of Ghana, which Nana is going to speak more about, I think. And so what we did is we went out and we did a survey of all 3,000 senior civil servants in Ghana's central government across 47 different organizations. So these are sort of ministry and department headquarters in the capital city. These aren't nurses and teachers and doctors. These are people who are in charge of budgeting and monitoring and human resources management, policy making, what we think of as core civil servants. Alongside that, we had a really huge effort of digitizing data on project and task completion. So from a situation of not knowing or not having readily analyzable data about the delivery of outputs and completion of projects of all of these 47 organizations, we're able to identify and code in a fairly reliable way about 4,000 projects and that were on the work plans of these organizations and were and should have been completed in the year, and we can look at whether they are actually completed and why not. And as we were doing the survey, we focused on these questions about how are you managed, and we thought about it as in this kind of way that I described before, with this division between there are practices that are related to monitoring and incentives. So do you have KPIs? Do you actually track them? How frequently do you review them? Are there incentives of some sort, either positive or negative, formal or informal, that are tied to your performance on these indicators? And does your performance have some kind of impact on your career progression? On the other side, there's a whole bunch of management practices that relate more to the use of autonomy and discretion in the organization. Do individuals know their roles and responsibilities? Do they know the roles and responsibilities of others and how they relate to each other? Do they know how what they're doing on a day-to-day basis it contributes to the overall mission of the organization and to intermediate steps? Do they know in what cases they can use their discretion? Are there venues available where they can use or where they can innovate, where they can suggest ideas? Is there a culture? Does the organization have a process in place to create a culture where those kind of innovations and flexibilities are actually encouraged rather than discouraged? And what we found was a bit surprising. So first of all, these two different approaches to managing are not substitutes, they're actually complements. So the better managed organizations have more and better incentives and monitoring, but they also have more and better autonomy and discretion for their officers. But that said, if you look at a sort of given level of monitoring and incentives that organizations are doing, for a given level of autonomy within an organization, there's actually a negative relationship between monitoring and incentives and performance. So the more that organizations are leaning towards these kind of hard tools of management, like monitoring of data, like incentives, the more that, or the worse that they're actually delivering their outputs. And when you step back and think about it, it's kind of obvious why that might be so, right? A lot of the things that the public sector does, as was mentioned in the past session, and particularly in the core civil service, are things that it's not delivering a tangible output, it's not delivering a passport, it's creating a policy, it's working in teams and trying to coordinate not only within the teams, but also across the teams. As we were looking through these different types of projects that the public sector executed, we also looked at what kind of coordination was required to deliver each of the projects. And there were almost no projects that didn't require any coordination outside the individual's own team. In that context, designing a good incentive system, even designing a good monitoring system, is really, really hard. And one thing that's been shown by research, not only in the public sector, but also the private sector, is that bad incentive systems backfire. So we think that that's exactly what's happening in Ghana. This is not also, and I think this finding is not, it goes against the conventional wisdom of the past 3 decades of public sector reform thinking, but it's also not an isolated finding. So my co-authors did a similar study in Nigeria, and they found, again, across a huge sample of organizations across the whole of the public sector, the exact same finding, this positive effect of autonomy on output, and conditional on that, an actual negative effect of monitoring and incentives. This is in some ways, I think, also quite useful research because Ghana and Nigeria are often used both by people within West Africa and without West Africa as examples of places where they would expect that corruption would be a huge issue, where lack of accountability, lack of motivation might be a huge issue. They're the kind of places that people don't necessarily expect autonomy in the public sector to be a good thing. And yet we find that it's so. It's also not just in these countries. So other researchers recently have done research showing that aid agencies that give more discretion to their country offices rather than their headquarters office in designing programs perform better. And the place that discretion makes the most difference is in contexts that are complex and unpredictable and unstable. So I think that there's a sort of this recent wave of research suggesting that actually we need to think again about professionalism and autonomy, not as alternatives to this agenda of performance management and data, but as things which we've been overlooking and which need to accompany them.
Okay, great. So we save your thoughts about Martin's presentation, and we'll move straight over to Nana, and we'll go through the four panelists and then bring together.
Thank you very much, and good morning, colleagues here. And I thank Prof. Wood and the team in the school for inviting me to be part of this session. Let me begin that when I became head of civil service about 2014, I went with just two ideas: do monitoring and get performance management going. So let's have performance contracts, let's sign them, let's do all those things. Let's get our structures in place, let's do organizational manuals, all the normal things. Because I've had a long history since 1998 of 88 of doing this big reforms, structural adjustments, decentralization, all that. But then I suddenly realized that things were not working. And thankfully, Martin and I had worked previously in my other life as head of management services. So we said, let's look at these things. And the issues that is raised are very important. Currently, we're focusing on very, very simple things. And I think it's very important. In this conference, I've heard a lot of big things. But if you look at what we heard this morning, the lawyer from America, he started with small things. If we listen to our colleague from India, he started with small things. And I go by the rock badger example, where the small things, as you consistently hit, the rock will break and will break through. What did I, after having learned from this, simple things, give more autonomy to the organizations, let them do. We've reduced this quest for what we call best practice travels to Singapore, to Malaysia. No. If you have a problem, go to that department, Environmental Protection Agency. They are doing something good. Go to Energy Commission, or go to a directory within your own place. And gradually, we're making a bit of impact there. The key thing for me, and I'm happy it came out this morning, the whole issue of morality, attitude, and spirituality. I think these are also very, very important. A lot of the things people tend to forget that attitudes play a major role. The way people look at issues. And I do ask very simple questions. If it were to be your own organizations, I met my chief directors or what we call permanent secretaries. If this were to be organization, will you manage it this way? Will you spend money that way? Is that the way we use resources? And gradually, people are beginning to change. It's a difficult struggle, but I'm convinced sincerely that it is the way to go. Does that mean there's no room for big projects? I've seen a lot of that, but big projects always come with issues of allowances. They come looking for new vehicles. They come looking for new computers. And at the end of it, after 3 years, 4 years, the DPs, that the development partners, withdraw, and we are back to square one. The emphasis now is on, and without all this kind of trade, let me tell you, the average director, deputy director in the civil service, if you look at their CVs, I mean, I usually say they have enough letters to be able to sink a ship. They've attended all these programs here, all over the world. But there isn't much by way of getting things done. So what do? Instead of emphasizing individual training, we are moving to the team approach. Bring a team together, bring a unit together, bring a directory together. Let them agree on 2, 3, 4 things, and then let them go and do it. We still do monitoring, but it's a different kind of monitoring. We don't go there as inspectors. We go in just to find what have you achieved as a person, as an individual. And basically, based on the research, that is what they wanted. They wanted a bit more technical support. That is true. So what I'm trying to say is, look, as far as I'm concerned, I went with a different view because I came from management service. I'm not saying performance management is not good in the traditional way. I'm not saying performance contract is not right. It is okay. We still do it. But beyond that, we need clearly to get to the very, and I saw the very simple thing, the subsystem. When I became head of civil service, I had a team from these multilateral organizations. They came and they said, Nana, we heard that you've been doing reform all your life. We want to do reforms. We want to help you. And I said, no, I don't need your help. You go, when we are ready, we will come. He said, we have a lot of money to support you. I said, then you come with conditionalities and all that. And I said, no, I'm not interested in it. Let me do the very simple things that I think we must do in the Ghana civil service. And interesting, what's happened is, because the civil service is central, gradually it's going into the other places. The other departments that are there are also beginning to learn. It's a long journey, it's a difficult one, but I sincerely believe that once there is always a start and there's a willingness and there's a commitment to do that. This morning we heard about change the narratives. What I normally tell my colleagues is that let's change, I don't use narrative, I say, let's change the story. The civil service servant is said to be lazy, corrupt, thus change the story. We have an African proverb that says that as long as the hunter goes to the farm alone or bush alone and kills an animal and comes back, and the story is written by the hunter, they will always be glorified. But maybe this time the animals must also write their own stories. Because when they begin to write their own stories, they will tell us how the hunters have missed several times and all that. What I'm trying to say. So that seems to be my emphasis. Tell your own story. In your meetings, tell your stories. When I get to the media, and the media in Ghana, we have a very proactive media. Of course, there's a lot of illiteracy that is shared under the guise of knowledge. But you have a very proactive media. And they go, and the first thing is, civil servants are lazy. And I say, you, small boy, small girl, what have you achieved in your life? You've not achieved anything. So I always turn around and change the story. And so I was very happy when he said, let's change the narratives. Colleagues, what am I saying? It's a simple thing that reform, civil service is very important. Service delivery is critical. But with all these strategies and all this change, I believe sincerely that it's attitude, first and foremost. Systems are useful and all those things. Attitudes, number one. Autonomy, number two. Allow people the freedom. Let them make the mistakes. That's one of the major things. The average public in Ghana does not understand that between the periods of August and March, the average civil service manager will not receive any resources because that's the way our system works. So between October to March, meanwhile, you're expected to manage organizations. You pay electricity bill, you pay all water bill, you pay everything. You have to manage the staff. How do you do that? So when people get upset and say corruption and all that, they don't understand the difficulties within which we operate. And I say, let's tell the story. Let's tell people. There are small things. Look, about punctuality. One of the greatest problems we have in Ghana is what we call Ghana Mean Time. It means all events start 1 hour after. When I got in the office, the first thing I did was and it was before, all my programs will start on time. My first meeting with my permanent secretaries, it was scheduled for 8:30. The first person showed up about 8:45. And by 10, we started. When they went to the office, and I'm telling this a serious matter, in Ghana, when you become a director, there's no assessment. You are free, you can loaf around. As long as you don't have a problem with any politician, you are comfortable. Chief directors, we don't do anything, or permanent secretary. I sent each of them, those who came late, a note, a query, explaining why disciplinary action should not be taken against them. That was weird. The next meeting was scheduled for 8:30, and by 8:20, 95% were present. So I just want to conclude by saying it's attitude, it's a lot of hard work. And these things gradually are changing because then and you wouldn't believe it, our politicians embarrassing my meetings. People, I don't know if it's being recorded, but I don't really care. People think I'm not a normal person by way of the head of civil service because I don't believe in behaving the way they do. But the point is, I've had politicians embarrassed in my meetings because they came 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes late. I simply say that we are starting this meeting 15 minutes late because this minister came in late. So everybody knows in Ghana that if it's a meeting that is being organized by Nana and the team, then you have to be there on time. I'm talking of attitudes, friends. We can talk of the big things, but just to summarize to say that, look, all the good things we've heard there, very powerful. But I believe that let's also at times look at the small things, and that can make a lot of change. Thank you.
Great. Over to you, Theresa.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I will just start by giving a little bit of context on my background, because it says President and CEO of Metro United Way, which is a nonprofit in Louisville, Kentucky. But I just joined that agency about 6 months ago. So prior to that, I was the Chief of Performance Improvement and Technology for Louisville Metro Government. And prior to that, I was actually a consultant at McKinsey & Company and spent 4 years there working in the public sector practice, but also with some private sector clients. And then before that, I was an officer in the United States Coast Guard. And so I've had experience in the sort of government side as an officer in the military, then working from an outside point of view as a consultant in a world-class firm that was going in and trying to add some structure to these conversations in different organizations, and then a practitioner, really trying to lead it in a city government. And so I'll definitely be speaking about all of those different experiences and what we tried to bring to the government of Louisville as it related to trying to deliver better services for citizens. And a lot of what I put in place there with the mayor and with others, my colleagues and peers, were based on things that I saw work really effectively in both a military setting and then also in the things that we were putting in place in organizations as we were consulting with them. And so some of them have been hit on already, and they're part of this theme of conversation over the last day or two. But I'll talk through some of the examples of how they really powerfully changed the culture and the environment in city government. Because I think, as Nana referred to, what I have seen is that government embodies both our highest aspirations, right? We expect government to do so much for us. It is going to pick up our trash. It is going to fix our roads. It is going to make sure that ambulances and medical personnel get to us when we need them. It is going to do all of these fabulous things, protect our property. But then we have this flip side of really low expectations. It is super bureaucratic. It is super slow. There's a lot of red tape. Folks who go in there are lazy. I mean, there's this narrative of stories around what you can or should expect from government. And some of those are based on, one anecdote, one instance that somebody may have had at one point with government, and that persists as the sort of story that everyone associates with what you can expect from your government. And you've got politicians who come in selling to people a narrative of what they are going to bring, promises of a new day, a new government, new services, better responsiveness. And I think that's really important. That clarity of what success looks like is an important piece of what is required if you are going to actually improve services in government. But there's two ways about going about that I think we sometimes fail on. One is this idea of not only does what success look like from the elected officials' view, which sometimes is often informed by citizens because they're reacting to what is happening in their community, but it also needs to be this idea of the civil servants, of those working in government, going and connecting with citizens and hearing from citizens the things that aren't working. So that helps define what success should look like for the public works employee who's picking up trash. It helps define what success should look like for the urban planner who is designing the next sort of set of policies that are going to inform 20 years of city development. You need to have that proximity and that connection to citizens to understand what do they define success as. That's really critical to this conversation. The other piece of it is, and I saw this happen quite often, is that when an elected official would come in, they're talking outward to citizens about what success is going to be and what they're going to do, but they never turn around and transfer that message down into the organization of the government. So how do you cascade that message and tell that story to those who are going to actually make it a reality? Because if you don't then take a moment to say, here's what I'm saying to the public, because not every civil servant is watching every press conference that the mayor is doing, then those civil servants aren't going to change their behavior. They're not going to start to do things differently, and then citizens are never going to get something different. And I think that's what we see often when you've got politicians who talk about a lot of stuff, but then there's never really the action to fall behind it, because you haven't taken the time to really build the structures within the government to do work in a different way. And there were some things that we did when we got into city government to make sure that this wasn't what we dealt with. And so very early on, our mayor was doing quite the same thing. He was talking outward about all of the things that he was going to deliver to citizens and all the ways in which he's going to improve city government. And we said, okay, well, now we need to translate this into what does it mean for our departments? What does it mean for the police officer on the street, for the public works employee who's picking up trash? What are they going to do differently because of what you're saying? And we needed to put some structures in place. So this idea of performance management, I do think it's a helpful place to start to ground the conversation, because you need to know what you're doing currently. And in some cases, we found that employees didn't have a good understanding of the big picture of what was currently happening. So they know their little piece of what they're doing, but without putting that together in a broader context of, hey, we're actually, not picking up the trash on time. You might be, but consistently as a whole, our organization is missing it this many times. Consistently as a whole, our organization is not repairing the vehicles for fleet on a time frame that's going to let folks get back out and get to their job. Consistently, our parks department is not maintaining the parks in a way that not only our citizens expect, but that is equitable across our community. Right? So when you start to look at the data and ask these questions about, well, we know citizens expect, and I'll take the parks example a little further, that our parks are going to be maintained at a level that would make us proud to go to those parks, that our kids are going to be able to run through the grass and it's not going to be above their heads, and that the playground equipment is going to be maintained at a level in which it's safe for them to be on, that the bathrooms are going to be operable. Well, how often does that actually happen? So we put in place a system, we called it our Louis Stat program, or Louisville Statistics, to be able to ask these questions of our departments. What does success look like for your agency? And how would we know if you were actually being successful? So if those are the markers of success for a parks department in their maintenance of our parks, well, how do we then go out there and get the data to tell us how frequently our parks live up to those standards? And we were able to see that in some cases, we're doing a fantastic job. But as you get more granular with the data, you recognize that, wow, there's several parks where the grass is not being maintained as frequently as other parks, where the equipment is not being maintained as quickly as in other places. And when you start to see where those parks are, you start to see a picture of the more economically depressed areas of our community, which happen to align to some of the racial divides in our community. And so then you get into these questions of equity. And it's not by any intention. It's not that those employees were intentionally necessarily trying to be inequitable. But you have to put that forward in the conversation and start to say, well, now how do we change this? We know now that this is what it looks like. How do we start to do things differently so that that's not what we see the next time we come together? And so in the performance management conversation, it was not faulted to folks that this is the reality and now you're in trouble for it. Because that's, I think, sometimes what happens with the performance management conversation is there's a set of standards, and if you don't live up to those standards, then you are faulted for it, in trouble, fired, whatever the thing is. Really negative incentives. And we made it very clear that we wanted to have this weakness orientation to understand and identify what wasn't working, but not to fault the messenger for raising that up, but to say now it is on all of us as a collective to solve it. Because when one area of government is not working, it persists the narrative that government doesn't work at all. And so this idea of working together across sort of the silos in government also starts to come forward. And one of the things that we heard through our parks department about why they couldn't get to all these different places was because, the fleet and facilities group wasn't maintaining their cars and fixing them fast enough. So where they could go to a Jiffy Lube, which is a company in the US that does oil changes and get an oil change in an hour, it would take them 6 days to get an oil change done and get their car back from the fleet facilities group. Well, sharing that message with the fleet and facilities group and saying, hey, here's your impact on this thing that is outward touching citizens, made them say, well, now I need to change my process. and I need to work to improve. And so how do they do that? Well, benchmarking and looking outside of government for ways to do that better. We brought actually Toyota in, who maintain vehicles and are very professional in how they do it, to help provide a benchmark and a process improvement for that group. So bringing that in is really important. And the last piece that I'll say in all of this was putting this power into the hands of the employees. So that empowerment piece, I mean, people want to have agency. They want to work on things that are meaningful. They want to know that their work is valued. And it's really important to make sure that we give them the space to do that. And when I say the space to do it, it is not only the time to do it, but the resources to do it. And consistently in government, we undercut people. We pull resources away. If you're doing a good job, it's not necessarily that you're going to get more resources, but you're going to get more work. And it makes it harder for you to do your work well. And so if we want people to operate in new ways, we need to give them the space to be able to do that. We need to give them some of the skills and training to allow them to do that, and the time and the grace to potentially fail. Because when you're doing new things, you're not going to get them all right on the first try. And so having that idea of it's a weakness orientation, it's okay if you're bringing the problems, it's okay if you're testing and trying new things. We're going to give you some space to do that. We're going to celebrate the wins, but we're also going to celebrate the failures as learnings. And I think that starts to create a culture that is much healthier, and that gives people that sense of pride in the work that they do. At least that's what we saw in our efforts in Louisville as we work to transform the government. I'd be happy to give more examples, but I know I need to cede my time to my wonderful colleague to the left.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Kate Josephs. So I am a civil servant, a career civil servant. I've worked in the UK government and very fortunately in the United States federal government, where I was executive director of the White House Performance Improvement Council. Returned to the UK in September, and I'm back now at the Department for Education. So the kind of thread that's run through my career as a civil servant, I probably came in, like many public servants, into sort of being quite excited about the idea of policy, and very quickly a sort of commonsensical bit of me realised that it really none of it matters very much if we don't deliver. So I love the quote, not quite sure where it came from, possibly Thomas Edison: vision without implementation is hallucination. And I try all the time to try and talk about that with my teams, because I think that while huge strides have been made, and we've talked about a lot of that over the course of the day, even in developed central governments, certainly in my experience both in the United Kingdom and in the United States, it is still the case that that sort of hard slog of delivery work is often seen as the sort of less glamorous, ugly sister of big policy vision. And so what I wanted to do today is just talk about a few observations I have, 3 observations I have about how that kind of manifests, but also some hopeful, building on our earlier speakers, some hope around how we can address that. And it does, a lot of it comes back to mindset. So the first challenge that I've really observed in a number of governments is around the pressure to deliver results, and that risk of getting into a kind of gotcha mentality around the use of performance management, performance data, and the idea that that pressure to deliver results, which is real and genuinely felt by politicians and civil servants, I think, isn't always matched with a sustained and intentional leadership attention on capacity, capability, and sort of an honest conversation about what it's actually going to take to deliver. So I have a slide. Sorry, I know we're not supposed to, but this is a hand-drawn picture on a napkin, so I think I'm allowed to have it. This is something. So I'm going to hat tip my old boss in the Performance Improvement Council, who's now the Deputy Mayor in District of Columbia, a guy named Kevin Donahue, who's a brilliant guy. And he shared this with me early in my career in the US to try and help me understand the way federal agencies work in the United States. I shall not tell you which agency it is, but essentially he started off by drawing these dots, and at the top there is the secretary, so the minister, the Secretary of State, and at the bottom is the caseworker. And so first of all, you can see there's this sort of visual representation of hierarchy and layers, which everybody understands is, kind of classic bureaucracy. And then he drew these kind of semicircles, and I was like, okay, what are these? And he's like, these are force fields. These are force fields that let the good news up and stop the bad news going up. And you can take those force fields, I think, building on what Theresa said, I think sometimes what those force fields also do is they don't enable a kind of really clear communication throughout, down, a really clear storytelling around why it is we're here. So there's a bit of a, now I'd be interested in whether people recognise this. If I was getting over the top, I'd start to draw lots of them, because of course the other thing I think many of us recognise in our careers in government is that it is the reality of silos. So first of all, how do you grapple with this? I think the first thing that lots of us who've worked in performance and delivery try to do is sort of poke holes in those force fields and say, actually, let's systematically try and get at what's going on here, because, again, thinking about proximity, there are people in our teams who are proximal. They're people out there on the front lines working every day with human beings, and some of those are in our own teams. And yet, within our organisations, we're not always very good at hearing from them or empowering them to bring that voice. And again, Theresa's examples in Louisville really give reality to that. The second challenge that is really clear for me is around complexity, and it might seem trite. Clearly, if we're focused on delivering outcomes, which we should be, by definition, what we are seeking to achieve in government is really, really complicated, and we're also working within these kind of delivery ecosystems that are just messy. They've been developed through years of sort of layers of reform. They've evolved over time. They're sort of finely in balance. And so that complexity is there. I think we've got quite good in government, and I've certainly seen this in the UK in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. We did a lot of work around building capability to describe that complexity, so to map it and to understand the system and to see what it looks like. And I certainly did quite a lot of that in the United States, working with multiple federal agencies on cross-agency goals. But what we do, so while that's positive and we're good at describing the reality, what I think we still haven't got very good at doing is actually thinking and remembering that delivery is all ultimately about people. Not just citizens and users out there who are really important, but our people and our people in our teams. And so that understanding of what motivates them and sort of coupling the understanding of the complexity of the system with an understanding of the complexity of human behaviour and a recognition that that's actually part of our job in delivery. So as well as sort of poking holes in force fields, I think one of the things I'm really interested in doing is understanding how we build our capability to understand public sector motivation, how we transform our feedback loops and engagement and our approach to engagement. I loved what Jeff Morgan said about the way you design engagement can change the kind of the nature of the discourse. I also think there's a huge, how many of us this morning were really kind of deeply moved by what we heard by our first speaker. That was because he spoke to the emotional part of our brains, and that idea that telling a story is not a kind of, it's not an add-on. It's a really important part of leadership, and it's a really important part of motivation and inspiring our people. And I don't think we spend much time talking about that in terms of government capabilities. The final challenge is just in terms of how we sort of make all those feedback loops and those holes in force fields work, comes back to data. And you would expect, wouldn't you, Theresa and I, to talk about data, because we're sort of confessed performance geeks. But I think one of my things around performance, if I could ban the phrase "what gets measured gets done" tomorrow, I would ban it, because it sort of belies a sort of history, and Martin spoke to this, of the idea that by measuring things and sort of seeking to develop the perfect measure of something that's inherently very complicated, we solve the problem. And it's surprisingly, I think, that attitude is the sort of focus on measurement is still really prevalent in a lot of public sector organisations, in both, especially I found in the US actually, and in US federal government, it really is. And so we get sucked into reporting for reporting's sake, analysis for analysis' sake. In my current job, we've had a lot of conversations around who's using this data, who's using this analysis. Our decision makers, not just very senior decision makers, but our frontline workers, are they using this analysis? Are they finding it helpful in the decisions they have to make every day? And if the answer is no, then how do we make it more useful? I think actually that's increasingly easy and hopeful. The kind of opportunity that new technologies bring, that a kind of increasing move towards open data and sharing of data, and frankly a sort of opening up of our analytic capability in government to bring in, more folks with a background in data science who can take very complicated data and say, actually, there's a story here that you maybe are missing, I think is hugely hopeful. And what I think I'm getting at there is, instead of trying to remove the force fields in a sort of classic, sort of visionary, strategic civil service way, we'll systematically change structures and remove the force fields. The force fields are there. They're probably there for all sorts of reasons. What we can do is, through the use of data and through the use of understanding motivation, poke those holes and then make them bigger. Sorry, I don't know if this metaphor is losing everybody, but it's essentially try and make the force fields a bit irrelevant. So to conclude, I think that at the heart of what I'm saying, all these challenges are surmountable, but we do need a mindset shift. And I think that's where, as leaders in the public sector, it's really important that we say that, yes, performance is about accountability, and it is about assurance, and it is about risk, and it is about all those things, especially the gentleman that mentioned Grenfell this morning. I think, we can't lose that it's really, really important that we have those features, and we do that very well. Yes, and it's also about foresight and learning and encouraging our organisations to build that autonomy and then learn from it. And just think, for me, it's sort of about saying, how as leaders can we model that, reward that, recognise that, create the conditions and the space for that to be the conversation we have. So I'm really happy to talk in kind of more specific detail about examples from the kind of US, UK or whatever, but rather than get sort of sucked in, I wanted to kind of create that context and then open up hopefully for a useful conversation. So thanks. You can lose the napkin if you like now, thanks.
Okay, great. So what I'll do is just pull things together a little and then suggest the direction we might take the discussion in, and then open up to general questions. So I think the thing that struck me was, and it was one of the things you said, was around people. There was a common theme running through all of what you said. And I mean, Martin started by highlighting that actually perhaps challenging some of the wisdom that people had, at least over the last couple of decades, that it's all about incentives and monitoring, and that actually maybe looking at both the Nigerian data and the Ghanaian data, that autonomy and professionalism are what's correlated with good performance in the public sector. And that then fed very nicely into what Nana said, which is it's all about attitudes and trying to change attitudes. And you gave a really great example of challenging lateness as one way in which you might challenge attitudes. And then coming through to what Theresa said about empowering people to have the space to use the data that you were collecting and think how to move forwards, rather than focusing on the failures, but actually learning from those failures. And then coming back at the end to what Kate said in terms of, well, how do we understand human behaviour? That was perhaps one of the challenges. I know you also focused on data and the pressure to deliver results and those force fields, but to do that, you really need to understand human behaviour. So it's a common theme running through all of this. So perhaps we could start the discussion on, well, how do we try and better understand what motivates people in the public sector? And how do we change these attitudes and encourage professionalism and autonomy? So thoughts from the floor. I'll take questions in threes. So who's got the mics? Okay, one at the back there. That was one hand to the lady at the back.
Thank you. One of the things that I've seen working within the civil service in the UK is that these sort of conversations around empowerment, motivation, about being able to be autonomous, about experimentation, is all very present. So I don't think it's that it's not going on. But I do think that one of the reasons that people behave in the way that they do is because every time they try something, and potentially if they fail at something, there is a parliamentary select committee or the media out there saying that that is a failure of government. And the cascade up that happens then is that ministers, kind of push back against that experimentation. So my observation, rather than a question necessarily, is that we're only talking about sort of one side of the challenge, and we need those mechanisms of accountability, but by default, those can have a suppressive effect on the creativity and innovation within government.
Okay, great. I should have said, can people make sure they introduce themselves? So can you just say...
Yeah, and I'm Leanne Saunders. I'm the Director of Strategy at the Foreign Office in the UK.
Fantastic. I'll take one more question from this side. Chap in the check shirt.
Thank you very much. Richard Sterling from Oxford Insights. My question is around confidence in public services and public servants. You know, a lot of the behaviours that we've talked about in this session and actually over the last day and a half are behaviours which are modelled by people who are self-confident. They're people who are open to criticism. They're people who are humble when they're in a leadership role. They're people who see the opportunity to talk to the people that they're working with directly as an opportunity to learn. And due to some of the things that my colleague was just mentioning, you know, around parliamentary select committees and accountability mechanisms and all of the strength that's gone into those over the last few years, there's a risk that we're in danger of removing confidence from public servants. So my question is, like, how do we find those confident public service leaders? How do we build them where we need them? And how do we reward them for demonstrating some self-confidence and some leadership? And do so even if the bets that they make don't come off?
Okay, and I'll take one more question in this round from the middle there, chap in the Dutch.
Hi there, Mark Robinson, Durham University. Thank you for a very interesting panel. I've actually changed my question because of Kate. I listened to Nana, and I had one question where I was going to have a go at what we can't measure, we can't manage, but then Kate sort of had a go at it. Now I feel duty-bound to defend it. Peter Drucker was the management guru who brought that idea in, and he has disciples on his website where they challenge people to come up with things in life that you can't measure. And, you know, things like poetry, and they then give a counter-argument, no, you can measure this. So my point is, whilst, you know, it can be taken too far, and there are bad examples where KPIs have been used ridiculously, often they have been very useful. And they've flushed out a lot of ineffective, bad management in a lot of areas. And it's shone light in where it wasn't previously there. So my point is, in terms of motivating people, I agree it's not everything, but it's got to be, you know, the basis for having some idea what on earth's going on in what you said were very, very complex areas of delivery. So back to my original question, Nana, you said, you know, it's about attitude as well as, you know, performance, and you gave one example of punctuality. Can you give any other, you know, examples where you've tried to, you know, make people change attitude and motivate people because of that?
Okay, great. So first question on, well, so far we've only captured one side of the argument. What about the external forces, select committees and the media? How do we get confident public servants? And then a pushback on what gets measured, what gets done. So should we go, let's start with Kate, as the last question was directed to you. Can I urge you, brief answers, and then we'll be able to take more from the floor.
So just on the what gets measured gets done, believe me, I am a disciple of measurement in the sense that I do it an awful lot and spend a lot of my time building capacity in my team to do it, and I'm indeed held to account for lots of very complicated. So I'm completely with you on the power. I think for me it's the sort of perverse effect that's happened, I think, in some cases, that people have become so focused. I mean, it links to this. So focused on that part of the work that that they're happy when they have a measure, as opposed to saying, "Is it actually? Well, now what do we do with it?" The only other thing I'll reflect on is just around, which I think the first two comments are sort of linked, actually, around, you know, confidence of public servants and how do we reward and recognise that. You know, maybe I'm a sort of naive optimist. I think we have to. I think partly we just have to sort of start small almost, and every one of us that thinks it matters do it. and do it visibly and talk about doing it and encourage our own teams to do it and try and build up from there. And I think we can talk with, you know, we can have conversations with ministers about those difficulties if it's done in a collegiate way. I mean, there's sometimes challenges you can't get round, but and some, you know, I'm not naive. There are some situations as civil servants where that's not possible, but my view is that we have to try as senior leaders in government to model it and be resilient and sort of be brave on it.
Great. So I would, on the first two questions, because I think that they can be linked slightly, you know, part of what we also need to do is to celebrate the successes and to make the successes of where government works well very apparent and visible for the public. There's a lot of things that work really well about government, and no one ever wants to focus on that, and I get that that's not going to be a headline every day. But one of the things that we've done in Louisville, which has been really powerful, and it was modeled off of something we saw in Buffalo, New York, is a program called Building Our Blocks. And so we recognize that every day we've got different departments going out and doing things that better our community. But they do them all over the community. Never are they all aligned in one location. And so whether that is picking up the trash, whether that is fixing potholes, whether that is cutting back debris, whether that is fixing a water main, whatever it is, we don't ever do that in a coordinated fashion. It's normally done all over the place, spread out. And so we started to say, well, what if in one morning we coordinated all of those different departments and agencies to go together and to do that in a 4 or 5 block neighborhood, so that citizens saw their city government at work in force. And, oh, let's connect that with maybe some other social service groups so that we could knock on doors and make folks who are at home at 9 o'clock in the morning on their porch, able-bodied, not working, aware of services that might get them into the workforce. Or if they had children in the home, aware of places where they could go to get their dentistry done or where they could get a health checkup. Let's go to the people. And it's been a huge, powerful thing of showing people what government does really well. And it doesn't cost anything because we're doing it already, but now we're just doing it in a coordinated fashion that's very visible. And so it's been a really good thing also for the people in government to feel proud of being in government. Because I think that successes beget sort of that spirit of, wow, you know, I'm proud to be here and we're doing great work and others are seeing it. And when you start to do that, you start to build confidence in the public sector and in your own confidence as an individual because you're part of a quote-unquote winning team that others recognize and celebrate. And then that leaders should also be celebrating that too. And so we also did an annual celebration that were awards for things in daily work, things in continuous improvement, things in innovation that were celebrating the wins that we were having in government, and we invited the public in. We didn't get a lot of public there initially, but then we coordinated it with other events that were naturally bringing people in so that they were forced to see some of these successes. And I think that that's really powerful and helpful. And it started to change some of our council members, so the legislators' opinion of what government was doing to make them a little bit less critical of it.
Thank you. The issue about what else have we done, I can give many examples. Not big ones, but they do a lot. The area of coordination. See, until we went into Constitutional Rule 1992, one of the requirements of the Office of the Head of System was to produce this annual report on the civil service. From 1992 up to 2015, it's never been done on time because it's a service-wide coordination, collaboration thing. I called a team together, first chief directors and the others, said, look, why do we have to do that? It's in the law. But I asked them, why do you have to do it? Somebody said, look, it's useful because president will know what we are doing, and it's a good report and blah, blah, blah. We even can learn from it. Fine. So are we prepared to meet the deadline? They said yes. And since 2015, we did it 2015, 2016, we met a deadline. Basically, that's it. Talking together, letting people have an understanding of the value of what they are doing. As distinct from just producing some report for you. It requires a lot of personal contacts, I must admit, but that is one of the things. The other thing that we can do, which we have done also very well relatively, it's from my own office. One of the things that came out from Martin's work was that people needed more support Previously, I thought, look, these people are directors, managers, let them manage. But then it came out clear that they needed more support. So our office became much more visible. And suddenly, the colleagues in my office, by the way, in Ghana, my office used to be called, it's Office of Head of Civil Service. But anecdotally, it was called Office of Hardships, Sorrows, and because people treated that place as if it's a Sahara. I mean, it was really a punishment to go to that place. Suddenly, the song has changed. And they felt, we've not improved financial resources, but people feel good. They go to organizations, and people are listening to them. So in that case, we can do that. Let me just quickly make mention about the confidence and the fear of the externalities. I think one of the things that managers, leaders can do is to be able to support them. I mean, quite recently, there was a case where a minister asked for some information, and I think one of the civil servants collected her. I think the information did not go right. He was not given the full information. So the minister got angry, said, I won't work with you. The chief director comes to me. I said, I don't have a problem. Bring the guy to my office, but you won't get another person back. Because this is a silly reason to say I won't work with him. All of us make mistakes. So they brought the person, and then the minister calls, Nana, we want a replacement. I said, there's no replacement, because all of them behave in that same manner. So there's no replacement. He goes back, and after 1 month, he comes back and it's okay, I'll take this guy. So the guy goes back to the manager. What I'm saying is, how do you improve confidence? By also ensuring that the leadership really stands up and support. I'm not quite sure whether next week by this time I'll still be the head of civil service, but I don't really care about that. My main concern is let's do our bit and let's support a system. Once we get the system going and we change small bit by bit, I think we can make. I'm a keen supporter of KPI. If the impression created was that those performance management tools were not important, they're critical. But I'm saying beyond that, there are these small things that we need to do to improve it.
And just very briefly, I think one thing which Nana has also done as head of civil service, which he didn't mention, was, which really speaks to this issue of people, is being very conscious about involving younger officers at the beginning of their career in high-level policy discussions and doing challenging tasks and offering their opinion. And I think what that does is create a culture that breaks down some of these napkin hierarchies and force fields and authorizes, if the head of civil service cares what I think, then also, my director should care what I think. And I can go and come with an idea, but also raise a concern. And I think, there's a lot of this discussion about risk aversion comes from the fear that we're going to do something and then get in trouble. But there's also the issue of, there are many scandals in government that happen precisely because lots of people know that there's a huge issue, but it gets covered up because of these force fields. And so I think from a leader's perspective, breaking those down is part of how you stay out of trouble as well.
Okay, can I take chair's privilege and just respond to your point about these external constituencies? So one of the things that's come out of what you were saying is the need to encourage professionalism. But I remember reading James Q. Wilson's book where he says one of the things that defines professionals is that they draw a lot of their rewards from external communities, the importance of peers and so forth. So I think if we're actually building up professionalism as a source of motivation, then the points that you raise about select committees within Parliament, but also the media, is going to be even more important. So I think we need to think about how we change attitudes in those external constituencies as well as changing attitudes within the organisation. Okay, I think have we got time for one more question? Are we allowed one more question? Okay, whose hand was up first? I think it was someone over on this side. I think your hand was up first. So.
Thank you. I'm Ruth Dixon. I'm a researcher here at the Blavatnik School, and Oh, is that on now? Thanks. I really took your point, Theresa, about celebrating success and so on. But one thing that really builds confidence in a government is how it responds to things that go wrong, and that a big source of information that we haven't touched on, I think, is complaints from the public about things, and we set quite high barriers for people to make a formal complaint. They have to negotiate websites and so on, have to write things down, they lose their anonymity. And I was wondering how government can use that for learning rather than for blame, and kind of make that part of their achievement of how they deal with problems that arise.
So can I ask you to respond? Perhaps you want to start, Theresa, because some of what you were talking about touches directly onto that, and then maybe a sentence or two response from the others. Yeah.
So we definitely started analyzing our complaint system when we first got into that Louis Stat program that I was speaking of. The point on, is that a system that's accessible to all, I think is a really good one, and I think it's a question that came up at the end of the last session around just technology in general. It's only one piece of the puzzle, and you have to allow for other avenues for citizens to be heard and to put into place their complaints. And so some of the things that we've been really intentional about are, again, how do we go out to where citizens are? But you can also use data to do that sort of more generally. And one of the things that I thought was really important in our discovery, and I've heard other cities speak to it as well, is when you start to look at where you're getting complaints and where you're not getting complaints. And then you layer that with the context of what you know is happening in your city, where investments are, where poverty is. In some places and in some regards, you actually don't ever hear complaints from citizens in those places. And it could be because they don't know how to access it, but it could be because they've also given up on government, right? And so they just aren't going to actually call you and report anything. And that was the premise of where we actually selected to go for our first set of building our blocks, sort of concentrations of work, was to those places where people weren't calling us, but we knew there were needs. And then our engagement with them was through that door-to-door, set of volunteer conversations of what's going on here, what are you concerned about in this neighborhood, what do you have questions about that maybe don't come up. And so it was another way to engage people in that conversation, to understand that you can't just rely on our formal complaint system because it may not be accessible to many people.
Kate, do you want to offer a closing remark on that?
I think I'll only add, just to sort of build on the theme I had around sort of how we need to also apply this mentality to our own organisations internally. I think the same applies for, what could be perceived as, oh, so-and-so over in this team's whinging about this thing. That sort of sense of actually, are we listening to our teams and our staff, particularly those staff who are actually out there working with, real human beings every day and getting that feedback and sometimes, having that real sense. And are we sort of creating the conditions to have an open discussion about their perception, but also to help see if they have a solution to the problem, which is, should be easier to do within our own teams. So I think it's a hard thing to kind of manage your own personal response when you see a complaint and you think, well, I immediately want to be defensive about that. And then to say, actually, no, we all need as leaders to say, okay, I can have a little bit of defensiveness, but I also need to understand where this is coming from, and again, to sort of model that for our teams.
Final remarks, Nana?
On complaints, it's one of my regrets, not in a negative way, because I've opened a mechanism and I think we spend a lot more time responding to complaints than had ever been done by the Ghana Civil Service. So I agree with you, it's a good thing because it offers one of the ways in which we can improve performance and service delivery. But on the negative side, it takes a lot of your time, but it's good.
Okay, so unfortunately we're now pretty much out of time and we all need to go from here through to, I think, a plenary address with Nairi. But just before we do, I think I'm going to just offer my takeaway sound bites from the panel. So the first being start small and gradual and change attitudes, which came from Nana. The importance of data, but in particular using data as a means of learning from failure. And we'll always remember the napkins now, breaking force fields and the importance of understanding public service motivation. And on the research side, that there is credible, thorough academic research showing that autonomy is associated with good performance, even in the most challenging environments like Nigeria and Ghana. So great, 4 things to take away from this session and into the next one. Thanks.